I've never been to the jungle, and I don't know that most people ever will, but this story is about a jungle and how it became the backdrop for one of the biggest atrocities against Black people, poor people, disillusioned people, just like the people you meet every day. These people were seeking paradise away from an America that in many ways despised them. This place was thought to be better than being invisible and having no place. This was about ownership, freedom from perceived religious oppression, and belonging. November 18, 1978 is a day that will live in the hearts and minds of many. I was in high school at the time and recall the barrage of news coverage about Jim Jones. The preoccupation with the man didn't leave much room for the people of Jonestown. Yes, the people. On that November day, when there was no hope or help in the air, 918 people lost their lives. These were mothers, fathers, grandparents, sisters, brothers, and children. Yes, children. Approximately 300 to be exact. I'm sure there are many out there who are unaware of the Jonestown story, the story of African Americans who were preyed upon and recruited by a sadistic leader because of their marginalized circumstances and who were vetted because they were people who had been disenfranchised from society. What is known is that Jones started his career in Indiana as an associate pastor who championed desegregation of a segregated church. His views were not shared, and he eventually would leave that church to form the People's Temple Full Gospel Church. He would later move his church to California, where his congregation would swell to over 4,000 members. Yes, he was credited as being one of the first mega churches. As his political influence grew, so did his paranoia and desire to have complete control over his congregations, who were primarily African American. Jones had been skillful in targeting this vulnerable population, many of whom were poor and disenchanted with their treatment as minorities in America. Stories of beatings, isolation, and cruelty began to surface from members. There were also concerns about tax evasion, so Jones, in his attempt to avoid the mounting media attention and the threat of losing tax-exempt status, relocated the People's Temple ministry to Guyana, South America, where he would be joined by almost 1,000 of his loyal followers. But the maltreatment continued, with members of Jonestown being totally isolated physically and psychologically from others. Mail was screened, phone calls were monitored, leaving was prohibited, and there was a consistent message that death was the penalty for defectors. As the maltreatment continued, pleas went to the U.S. Embassy to intervene. However, later FBI records would detail the lackadaisical response to former defectors and families within the United States. The U.S. government was reluctant to intervene for political and religious freedom reasons. When visits from the embassy did occur to Jonestown, people were directed to stage an environment where everyone was free and able to do what they wanted. There was no strong or compelling indication that there should be any U.S. intervention. But there were so many red flags. For instance, there were 200 wards of the state of California living in Jonestown, yet there's no record that the Department of Child Protective Service ever visited them. Attempts by family members to visit were blocked. There was a documented complaint about a family member visiting and not being permitted to leave. There were numerous forced transfers of assets to the church. There was documentation of illegal gun shipments to Jonestown, but no one questioned why Black citizens of the United States were leaving en masse to relocate to Guyana. The U.S. Embassy in Guyana had been subjected to numerous Freedom of Information Act requests from Jonestown so that their communications could be monitored. This created a chilling effect for the officials to monitor what they were putting in written communications. One of the sparks that began diverting U.S. attention to Jonestown was Victor Stowen. He was the 5-year-old child of former People's Temple members who had agreed to allow their son to be raised in the commune of the church. When the parents found that their child had been taken to Guyana, they demanded his return to the States. When Jones was notified of the demand, he refused. The pressure from families continued and reached the ears of California State Representative Leo Ryan. He had been totally unprepared by the U.S. Embassy on what to expect when he decided to go to Jonestown to see for himself what is happening. A press crew accompanied Ryan to Guyana. Here you see the reception that was staged for Ryan and his crew. It was reported that Ryan remained at Jonestown for 22 hours and confirmed what families had been telling him. The Jonestown residents were slipping notes to him and his delegation. That day, 15 people asked to immediately return to the States with him, and you see them pictured here. Ryan and his delegation departed Jonestown to return to the airstrip to board their plane with the 15 defectors who had asked to leave. Little did Ryan know that one of the defectors was a Jim Jones loyalist. What was also unknown was that a truck full of armed Jonestown members were directed to follow Ryan. The pretend defector that had traveled with Ryan's delegation boarded one of the planes and began firing on the people inside. The truck filled with armed gunmen began shooting at the Ryan delegation. State Representative Ryan and 4 others were murdered and 11 were wounded.
How very much I've loved you. How very much I've tried my best to give you the good life. But in spite of all of that I've tried, a handful of our people with their lies have made our life impossible. There's no way to detach ourselves from what's happened today. Not only we're in a compound situation, not only are there those who have left and committed the betrayal of the century. Some have stolen children from others, and they're in pursuit right now to kill them because they stole their children. And we are sitting here waiting on a powder keg. I don't think this is what we want to do with our babies. I don't think that's what we had in mind to do with our babies. It was said by the greatest of prophets from time immemorial, no man takes my life from me, I lay my life down. So to sit here and wait for the catastrophe that's going to happen on that airplane, it's going to be a catastrophe. Almost happened here. Almost happened. The congressman was nearly killed here. But you can't steal people's children. You can't take off with people's children without expecting a violent reaction. And that's not so unfamiliar to us either. Even if we were Judeo-Christian, if we weren't communists, the world, the kingdom suffereth violence, and the violence shall take it by force. If we can't live in peace, then let's die in peace. We've been so betrayed.
Temple members would pass out a grape drink that was laced with cyanide and Valium. Some members voluntarily drank. Hundreds of innocents and resistors were injected. Jones himself would not drink the deadly cocktail, but instead would end his own life with a self-inflicted gunshot wound. In total, 918 people died that day. That included 300 children, most of which were African American. Not everyone died on that woeful day, and you're getting ready to meet someone who survived. Okay, hello everyone. I want to welcome you to another episode of Tabernacle Talks. And this is Dr. Michelle with a very special guest today. And our guest is Ms. Leslie Wagner Wilson. And for those of you who can actually see this book, I want to tell you, it is an amazing, amazing story about survival. So certainly while there is a story, a backstory, there's a much bigger story that I hope, and a much bigger lesson that I hope people get when we talk about beyond obedience. Welcome to Tabernacle Talks, Leslie.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you. And before we get started, I'd like to just have a moment of silence for the 918 souls that crossed over on November 18th, 1978. Thank you for that, for allowing
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. And I hope that that gets everybody in the right state of mind about what we're talking about. It was probably one of the most horrific events in American history. And you are a part of that history. I guess we can just start where we start. How did you escape? We're going back to November the 18th, 1978. That was the actual day of the massacre. How did you escape?
Really, God put these two people in my presence, because Jonestown became a place that was full of paranoia. So you couldn't trust anybody because they had spies that would infiltrate certain groups, and then they would report on whether or not they were being obedient. And so I worked in the medical office. I was supposed to be sent to Cuba to become an OBGYN. And the pharmacy tech, her name was Diane Louie, came to me. We started just, feeling each other out and having a conversation and trying to see if she was for or against. And it turned out that she was against Jonestown. And she said, my boyfriend is trying to develop a route to escape. And I said, please take me and my son. And so the day that Congressman Ryan came in, it was just chaos. It was controlled chaos. People were running around trying to get ready. There were people that were told that they could speak to the congressman, those that couldn't. And so you could tell there was a sense of just fright, fear in the camp, because we didn't know what to expect. And so Diane came to me and she said, we're going to leave tonight, which was November 17th, the night before. Congressman Ryan showed up, and we put on a good show, as we always did for guests. And later on, someone passed a note and said they wanted to leave. And so she said, Richard said, we're going to leave tomorrow morning, which was Saturday, November 18th. So we decided to meet at the kitchen area. I had my son, Jakari, who was 3 at the time. And my husband, Joe, came up to me and asked where we were going. And I said, we're going on a picnic. And he just said, a picnic? Because you didn't have picnics in Jonestown because there was no open kitchen. Once dinner or lunch or breakfast was over, it was over. So it was such a ridiculous, I think, excuse that it didn't even register in his mind. And so, but he said, not today. And he grabbed our son, and he took off, right? So I went to see my mother, and I said, Mom, I'm going on a picnic. And she says, a picnic? And she knew her daughter. I was kind of the rebel in the family to a certain degree. And I was able to hug her and kiss her, not knowing that was the last time I was going to see her. So my plan was to get out and go get my father, who was part of the concerned relatives, and come back and get my mother. I don't know if she would have wanted to go. I don't think so. But at least my sister, my brother, and, my niece and nephew. So we started. Joe came back and he gave me my son. He said, just don't go anywhere. And there was such tension in the air, you could just cut it with a knife. And so we proceeded to leave. And we walked up this hill where we were fully exposed. And I was waiting for the bullet. Because they had to have seen us. I had Dakari tied with a sheet on my back. So we proceeded to go up this massive hill, and I'm waiting for the gunshot. And we get to the top, and there's just this warmth that comes over me from head to toe. And I heard this voice said, "It's going to be all right." And we proceeded down this road, and we ended up getting lost in the jungle because the relatives came back, people came back into the compound. So we were on the wrong side of the road, and we ended up on the side of the guard shack. So we proceeded to walk. The choice was Port Kaituma, which was only 7 miles. That was Richard's original plan. I never asked about the plan because I didn't want to, for them to think that I was being, make them suspicious of me and why I was asking this information. So I was just following them. Well, we couldn't go to Port Kaituma because we ended up right where the guard shack was at the gate. So we ended up walking the 30-something miles, right? Until it was dark. A train came by, the conductor looked, and he just stared at us and thought, what are these people doing with these kids on the road? I didn't even know a train came through because once you came in Jonestown, you really didn't go out, right? You didn't have an opportunity to go out. And so the train came back and the men said, we're going to ask somebody, try to find a friendly face, go to, and ask to call the embassy. And they took us to the police station. And the police drew guns on us. And they said, who are you? And we said, we're from Jonestown. He said, there was a shooting at Port Kaituma. So we had no idea what was happening back in Jonestown. So the captain said, we heard it was like a slave camp. And so we knew he was a friend and not a foe because we didn't know what we were walking into. But on that day, we were all prepared to die. We exchanged phone numbers. I said, if you see me shot, grab my son, try to get him out of here. We were prepared to die trying to get out of that hell because that's exactly what it was. Later on, the wee hours of the morning, the captain came in and said, there's a report, 500 dead and 500 have ran into the jungle. And I just cried and cried and prayed, God, please, please allow some of my family to survive, if not all. And then we went into Georgetown and we were there for 2 weeks, pretty much under house arrest because this was an international event. They didn't have any information really about what happened. They didn't know who was a gunman, they just didn't have any clues. So we stayed in a hotel for 2 weeks until we were allowed to come back to the United States.
So because they didn't know who you were, they just assumed we're going to detain you until we can figure out what's going on.
Exactly. But it was almost as if, I think I needed that time because every time someone walked through the door, I was hoping it was one of my family members. I was praying and I was so hopeful. I thought maybe someone got to Venezuela, because we were on the border of Venezuela, and they would show up. I was so hopeful that somebody survived. So it was almost a decompression time process for me, a little decompression, because I had no idea what was coming.
While you escaped, your family didn't, and you lost 9 family members. Your mom, your sister, your brother, a niece, a nephew, and a husband. And you returned with a 3-year-old who I understand was the youngest survivor.
Yes, he is the youngest survivor.
And I'm going to show people the terrain there because, you saying it, I'm going to show it so people can see what you had to do to get free. Talk to me about the enormity of what you did.
I was so grateful to leave. And as we were walking this 30-something miles, I was thinking about my family, was able to get them out. And then I was fearful as to, was I doing the right thing? Because we were so brainwashed to a certain degree. But it was horrific. I just remember one thing we were taught in the church or in People's Temple was when we were up against anything that was an adversity or painful or trauma, you pushed it down and you kept moving. So I pushed all that fear down and I just put one foot in front of the other. We were a team at that point. When that train came back and we didn't know who was on that train, we picked it up. We kept walking, faster, faster. The men helped me carry Jakari when he got too heavy. We were just like this family that we knew that if we were caught, we were probably going to be killed on the spot or dragged back to Jonestown and face enormous punishment, enormous punishment. And so my thought was just to get my son out because there was no future conversation in Jonestown. There was no talk about our children being sent to college or what they're going to, can we teach them lessons that we learned, this beautiful humanity that regardless of race, even though the majority of women, majority of Jonestown was Black, to teach them to be loving and compassionate and care about the world. Could we send them back into the world to be an example of this? There was no conversation about that. There was no future. And I looked at my son and I thought, this is not what I want for him. And when I realized I was not going to be sent to medical school, I thought, no, I don't want to do this. But my plan was to go and bring my family out. To this day, sometimes I feel, Leslie, how did you not know? How did you not know that this wasn't going to happen? But I never thought that we would die from the inside. I thought we would be killed from the adversaries from the outside. So what we were it was a farce. It was really a farce. So one thing I wanted to mention is that I did not think I would see the age of 21. I just did not see a future in Jonestown. So as kids, we were taught to how you endure torture. And we were taught death from an early age when I joined in 13. So I never thought I'd see 21. And then as things got worse in Jonestown, Jim kept saying, the Guyanese liberation, now they're the enemy and they'll be coming in with tanks and guns. And so death was not, I didn't fear death. It was interesting at that young age.
You're very modest. I think about who you are and what you did. And when I first met you and I start reading your book and I'm like, this is probably one of the most tragic things I've ever read. Mm-hmm. And that I've ever seen, but you didn't stop there. Okay, let's get you back to you're in the States now. You've survived.
Right.
You would think that you would be treated with a hero's welcome when you got back. What happened?
So when I got back, I remember being in the plane and looking over New York City out the window. It was night. We were flying into JFK, and this enormous fear just engulfed me. And I thought, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? What am I going to do? Right? Because I'm coming back to a country that I was taught to hate. And even though Jim Jones and People's Temple, that was a whole different situation, what we were taught was real. What was happening was real. And so I was petrified. So when we came back, we were brought into a hangar and basically fingerprinted. And we were interviewed all night, FBI, Secret Service, Department of Treasury, asking all these questions. So I ended up with Joe's parents' house in New Jersey. And the next day, they welcomed us. Mama had came and gotten Jakari off the bus so she could take him home because it was late. And it was, in December. So the news people came and were just engulfing the house about, how did you follow this white man in the jungle? Just very cold and no compassion at all. And I just closed the door and I went in the house. What's interesting is 2 weeks later, I was in New York City. I caught the PATH train from New Jersey looking for a job. 2 weeks. Because remember, we were taught just to bury everything and keep going. And at that point, I really hadn't come to terms. It had only been not quite a month, the fact that I lost my entire family. So I was in denial right away. And I was just hopeful. And I just pretended like nothing happened. I ended up back in California with my grandparents. But the media had stigmatized us so much. They were so hateful and so callous. because it was headlines. This is the first time that this many people had died, you know, American citizens before 9/11. This was unheard of. And so we were, you know, people were called baby killers. And so I went underground. I changed my name. I didn't talk about it. There was a couple people that knew what my experience was, but I came back and I didn't receive any mental health. My grandparents were 80 years old, right? My mother was an only child, and they were just glad. I remember calling from Guyana, and I talked to my grandfather, and our pastor came on the phone. And he said, "I've got your grandmother here. We almost lost her." And she got on the phone and she said, sorry. She said, "Thank you, Jesus. Thank you, Jesus. I prayed for one and I got two." And so it just, how do they couldn't deal with that. So no one said, because they didn't know. They would just say, "Be strong, you're strong, you're strong, you're strong," not knowing that my heart was broken into a million pieces. The trauma of it hadn't taken effect yet. So I didn't get the mental health I needed. I never sought mental health treatment at all. And so I buried everything and I pretended like nothing happened. And so years came by, and of course, I was experiencing self-destructive behavior. How could I not? I was angry. I suffered from a horrible trauma, and I never gotten any help. And so for 20 years, my life was pretty much, you know, I would say actually up to the age of 50, I was still in disarray. My life was still in disarray. I worked, I pretended that I wasn't who I was. People would sit at the office conference room and say, "What about People's Temple? Those crazy people, so-and-so." And I would just say, "Why do you say that?" Maybe they saw something they didn't like in the States, right? And so I'm trying to interject and defend without exposing who I was. That was a burden to live two different lives. That was a burden for me. And it took its toll. It took its toll.
You mentioned that the majority of the people that died in Jamestown were Black women. Can you go into that a little deeper? Because I don't think that the general public, when there was communication, they just said a lot of Black people. Mm-hmm. They never even said percentages. I mean, I've seen percentages as high as 80%, 75 to 80% were true. Black people. The majority were Black women. So tell me, explain that to me. That's just incredible.
You know, my mother was a business owner. I grew up in an upper middle class family. Once my parents divorced, my mother moved from San Francisco to Santa Rosa. She had a care home for mentally ill patients for Napa State Hospital. She had her own business. She was home with us always. And so when she divorced, she wanted to be home with us. And so I don't know what was missing from her, because of course you don't talk about those things as a kid back in the 70s while your parents divorced. But my sister was on drugs, and that's how we got to Ukiah, my sister Michelle. So eventually my mother just decided to move. So I don't know what was missing in her life that she moved us from Santa Rosa, sold the business, sold the house into Ukiah, bought a house, and then sold a house. And my brother and I ended up in a 2-bedroom apartment. We had never lived in an apartment. My mother and I shared a room, and my brother had his own room. So my mother had already bought in. So I didn't understand, because I was a child that came in, what the appeal was. But what I realized is that there was something missing in her life, and People's Temple gave her a sense of safety, a sense of belonging, a sense of community, a sense of trying to make the world a better place, right? That was the tenets of People's Temple. So I say, first of all, People's Temple wasn't a church. And I say, basically, the people were the disciples of Christ, not Jim Jones, right? Because they truly, the majority of them wanted something better. And so we were in the turbulent times of the 70s with the civil rights movement, We had the Vietnam War, we had the Black Panthers, we had the SLA, we had the Muslims, Nation of Islam. There was always different groups trying to do, I believe, good work to make our world a better place and safer for our children. My mother just got caught up in that. And so I never had the conversation of why she joined. I know when Jim was talking about having sex with men and women in the pulpit, that I think would have been the time that she grabbed our hands and ran, but she didn't. And so she stayed. And so I think the appeal was just the fact that People's Temple reached out to everyone. And in San Francisco at that time, there was a lot of turbulence as far as racism and women being mistreated. And they just felt safe. When I tell you that in a church, after a service, downstairs, women could have all their own vending, right? The hot dogs, the cookies, the fried chicken, the ice cream and waffles, the clothing. They were able to actually expand on their entrepreneurship. And that was an appeal too. However, I think it got to the point to where I would say they compromised so much and they had given so much. So my mother ended up living in a commune with 3 other women, giving all her income. And there were so many women that did that, but they still felt a sense of community. And I believe that all the horrific punishments that were received, and the fact that after a while, I knew at 18 something was wrong with Jim. There was something wrong with this picture. This man is very sadistic. The people are sadistic. I looked at the leadership. It's all white. Where are the Black folks, and who are supporting this venture? But I think they gave so much they couldn't see past that. It's almost, they compromised, right? They're like, okay, I cannot believe that no one felt something was wrong when we had to sign blank pieces of papers for confession in case we left. They could say, oh, she's that, they could write in, I murdered somebody. I was a pedophile. I was a thief. We willingly did this, right? So that was that toxic leadership, toxic fellowship, basically. And so I think they just gave too much. And I think we wanted Jim's approval so much because we started calling him father. And at that point, I couldn't relate to that until when I came back, I was in a very abusive relationship. I had this sign on my head that said damage, naive. And I ran into somebody that took advantage of it. And when he used to beat me, I would feel bad, and it kept happening, breaking me down. And I'd say, well, what was I doing wrong? It must be me. And then you say, then you make up and he's like, I'm sorry, right? I'm sorry for doing this. And then you say, okay, you remember the good times. That was People's Temple. People's Temple was an abusive relationship. It was an abusive relationship. And so at that point, I just believed, as I said, the women found a safe place to be to a certain point, and they just chose to ignore everything else, similar to what we're dealing with now in our current political situation.
It's interesting you talk about that sense of community, because when I was doing the research, you could see where they had a sewing area. You could see where they made toys. I mean, they actually came up with a productive work environment to keep you completely enclosed in this area. And I'll be able to show the audience how you see this one road coming in and you have this sign, like welcome to Jonestown. But if you look at an aerial view, you can see you're just surrounded by nothing but jungle.
That's right.
You truly were in a remote location. And yet when you're in your area, you don't feel that way because there's the basketball court, there's the playground, there's all these nice amenities that would make you think it was a resort. But behind that, you noted the bathrooms didn't give privacy, the showers didn't give privacy. So some of the basic things that you would have had in terms of privacy, you gave that up too.
That's true. Right.
Okay, your book.
Yes.
And this book, what I'm going to put it up on the screen as well so everybody can see it and let them know how to get your book. You called it The Slavery of Faith. and it chronicles your struggle through People's Temple to Jonestown, and actually your re-engagement to society, because none of those things were easy for you. What has life been like? You've talked about, abusive relationships, and life has not been easy because you didn't get treatment. There wasn't a group of people that said, you're going to have post-traumatic stress, syndrome. So we need to make sure that we get you help. None of that was done because they treated you like a criminal instead of a victim.
Right. Well, there was a group that was assigned to us, but I didn't trust anyone. I didn't trust anyone. There were some people that, there was services set up in San Francisco, but I didn't trust anyone to talk to. I just didn't. And so no one said, my grandparents didn't push me because they didn't know. But I think I suffered. I suffered every day for years. I didn't want to get up. I really was suicidal at one point, but I wouldn't take my own life. I would put myself in situations that hoping somebody else would do it for me. And that's how I felt. It was so painful to live, although I put in the effort because I had other children, and I tried to, be a better mom, and that failed in many ways. And I tried to be happy. That only my children made me happy after I realized what a horrible mother I was at a point. And so I made a decision. I was married. I had a beautiful home. I was living the American dream. I was selling real estate part-time, running a medical office, but I wasn't happy. My soul was just crying out. My soul was crying out. And I knew that I had to build a special personal relationship with God. Now, I joined churches, but I was suspicious. Every time I go in, I was looking for something like, oh, why is that man there? Looks like a security guard. So I couldn't get past that, but I realized that in order for me to grow, because I couldn't leave this world not being connected to the source, to God, to Jesus. I just needed that. I needed that. And I thought, I owe this to my family. I owe this to my family. And so I divorced because I could not do what I needed to do in this relationship. And I knew I was going to take a financial hit. I was ready for it. And I moved to Atlanta, and I got quiet, and I got a job, and I started writing and crying and trying to heal, every time I put my foot on, off the bed, I thought, oh my God, another day. That's how I felt for years. Another day, I have to suffer another day. That's how hurt and traumatized I was. But I made a personal decision that I wanted to develop a relationship with Christ. And I was always on the fence because of Jim Jones' teaching. So I was confused there. And so once I made that decision, I studied, I prayed, I read, I isolated. And then one morning I woke up and I put my feet on the ground. And I thought, oh, I can breathe. I can breathe. I can breathe. And so the decision was tough, and it's still ongoing, right? This decision to create a personal relationship with God, to try to be the best person that I can, to reach out to people who are in pain and share the story and let them know that, we look for things on the outside to fulfill us when it's all in here. It's all in here. It's all in here. And so with that, I keep moving forward. And sometimes it's difficult. I'm not saying that. There's days when I don't want to do an interview. I don't want to talk to anybody. I go through those moments, but when I put God first, then I'm like, okay, because this is a testimony to the power of belief, because there was a year before, almost a year before Jonestown, the tragedy, I was so disgusted. I was out in the back looking up at this beautiful Guyanese sky. And I said, Lord, let this be my last year here. Now, I wasn't sure if there was still a God. I thought maybe God's not going to listen to me because I'm calling this guy Father, right? And I prayed that prayer, not knowing whether or not it would be answered. And it was. And so this is a testimony to the power of belief and not giving up when you want to. I was angry for a long time ago. How could you let this happen? And then why me? Why me? Why not my brother, who is this incredible child? Oh my gosh, my brother was so incredible, as was my sister. Why me? And I was angry at that because now I have to live a different life. Eventually I have to get it together, right? And then that change is difficult. And so I'm grateful every day for what I've experienced. One woman came up to me and she said, baby, she said, you had the most horrific life. And I said, have I? And I said, but I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be here at this very moment right now had I not gone through what I went through. And so the purpose is for me to educate and try to share the story, because there are many cults still out there, because nobody joins a cult. They don't. They're recruited. I recruited. We were recruited. And I went out and recruited people because I believed at 15, 16 years old. And so if we don't tap into the spirit within us and develop that personal relationship, we are going to be misled. Because what I call that God sense, that's what I was feeling. And every moment since then, when that God sense kicks in, I do not doubt it. Whatever the spirit says, move, I move. Go left, go right, go up, go down. Say this, don't say this. I listen to the spirit, and it's a constant practice. It doesn't happen overnight, but you have to trust. And once you trust, right, then all things are possible. And they just are. And that's why the book Faith is so important, because I have faith. I still have faith. And not saying it's not shaken at times, but I pull myself back in. Like, you got to remember who you report to.
Leslie, your website, and I want to direct people to your website. It's lesliewagnerwilson.org, and I'll put that on the screen so people can see that. You talk about soul restoration. Mm-hmm. Is that what the majority of your work focuses on? And can you kind of walk me through, when you talk about restoring your soul, you certainly have gotten to a place where you restored, you needed restoration. Mm-hmm. How are you giving that message to other people?
Mainly, sometimes it's one-on-ones. People call, they'll make an appointment, we'll have a conversation over the phone. We might have 2 or 3. There's people that have reached out to me that I've called just because the spirit just, they give me phone numbers. So I call this one woman. She said, oh my gosh, I can't believe you called. I said, but you left your phone number. Is it okay? She goes, yes. But she goes, you called at the most, I was having the worst day ever. And it was the worst day for her. And so I just follow the spirit. So people, I like the one-on-one interactions because I can develop a relationship with people. I'm not a licensed therapist. I just share my story and how I got through. And everybody's journey is different. But in order to, if our soul's not restored, we don't live a fulfilled life. We can't. What do you think? One of my goals is when I leave this world, I want to hear, Papa Winan said, well done, good and faithful servant. That's what I want.
Leslie, your story, I think about your loved ones. The U.S. government, they had these helicopters. They did a lot of photo ops that they were airlifting and bringing those bodies back. Did they bring your family back?
They did. And, when you mention that, every time I see those bodies, I search those bodies for my family. Every time. I'm looking for some remnant. I know what my mother had on that day. I'm looking for some to say that's my parents. They flew my family to Delaware. My father retrieved my sister and my brother's bodies. You cannot open the caskets. My mother and the children are buried at Evergreen in Oakland. What was interesting about that was that my brother weighed more than my sister, which was impossible. My sister was like 5'10". My brother was my height, 5'3". And so they just they were not identifiable. They weren't. So they just said, here, got names and sent them off. But at least I got a decent burial. They're in the Bay Area. with a headstone, but nobody wanted the bodies. Nobody wanted the bodies. No one in the United States wanted the bodies except for Evergreen Cemetery in Oakland said, we'll take them. We'll take the bodies. Isn't that something?
You always, from day one when I talked to you, you always were very reverent of the other people there. You just always said you wanted to make sure you represented them. And I want to tell you, you do. You have. I think your story is compelling. Just your personal ability to just survive. That's just all I can say is you're a survivor. And you knew that you couldn't do that alone. You knew that there had to be something much bigger and much deeper than you. And I see this joy in your face in spite of tremendous suffering. And I have to tell people, get her book because you'll see she was spunky.
I was.
There were points in that book where I feel like, oh my, she's not going to do it. People stipple because you always had this strong sense of who you were and what you were going to accept and what you weren't going to accept. And so when I read that and I know that you survived, I know that's why you're a survivor. Is there anything that you want to leave the audience with that you just think is so important for them to take away? I know that they're in a couple of weeks, they're going to be able to call in and actually ask you questions. But if somebody doesn't get to make it back on, what's that thing that they need to take from all of this and what you learned?
I would like to say that, it's very easy to fall if you're not in a good place. It's very easy to fall prey to predators. And they come in all forms and all shapes, all races. You have to be very careful of who you connect with and not being paranoid. But I would say if you feel something's wrong, and trust that because that's your God sent speaking. There are many, there's many cults. They don't call them cults in mainstream religion, right? We see it on many fronts. And so it's important that you remember who you report to. If you're a believer, and even if you're not a believer, if you have a sense of morality and a sense of what's right and what's wrong, that's all you need. But it's our purpose, I believe, in this world to serve each other in a way that is going to bring us light and bring us forward and bring us love. We've put so much focus on material things. And when people say, what do you do? They don't say, they say, oh, I do this for a job. Say, oh, well, I'm a compassionate person. Let's change the terminology, right? I'm a being that I'm trying to be better, or I'm trying to show more love. The characteristics should be internal, not on the outside, because that's not what God's looking for. God doesn't care. Jesus doesn't care about all that, right? It's the soul. It's the soul. So I hope that people take away and know that this can happen to anybody. You may not think it can't. And if there's anyone that is suffering or going through this, feel free to reach out to me if you want to provide the web page. There's a contact there. If you feel like you want to talk about an experience or an organization that you're in that you might think is a cult and you see that there's cult-like tendencies, then reach out. Because and it's very hard to leave. It's very hard to get out of a situation, especially when family members are in there also. But just be mindful and be prayerful and trust your God sense. It's there for a reason.
Leslie Wagner Wilson, you have been an outstanding spokesman for the people of Jonestown, and they're the people. And I would encourage everyone, if you don't know this story, read it and read it with a different level of compassion than the compassion that survivors were shown when they came back, because not everybody went willingly.
That's right.
Not everybody went willingly. So
that's right.
We can't judge the situations under which people went. Thank you so much for coming on Tabernacle Talks. And we're going to see you in 2 weeks when people can ask you questions.
All right. Perfect. All right. God bless. Thank you.
God bless you.
You take care.
You too.
Thank you.